Israel Revelations. Our goal with this event is to potentially bring this curriculum onto campus to offer it for all of you guys to learn and see everything that's inside of it. It's some great things, and I really think that you guys are going to enjoy this event. So, I'll do it.
See, they're applauding for you already. Thank you guys for coming. I know it's the end of the day for you, and I really appreciate it. I want to thank, first of all, Our Soldiers Speak, the organization who also worked with Ari to bring me down here. It's a pleasure to be here. I love Florida. I live in Toronto, so feel free to bring me back as often as you want, especially during the winter months. Okay, so a couple of things. You notice 3 questions up on the screen, which are going to form the backbone of our talk. I'm going to explain at the beginning that there's really no way that I can do more than just a bit of a superficial presentation today. That second question, just on its own, I have a mentor who spent 25 years researching it. I'm going to give you the highlights today. There is a book if you decide that you want to read a bit more in depth after this. And there's also an online course that's in development that will be able to give a much broader presentation. So, you know, today you'll get the highlight reel. And I want to just explain that, you know, one of the problems with a highlight reel is you don't always get a chance to do both sides really, really well in a highlight reel. Okay, so I'm going to do the best I can to just give you, you know, a historically accurate presentation. But, you know, you'll have to forgive me that, you know, sometimes I'm going to have to basically give you a little bit more one-sided presentation because we don't have a chance to do 2 sides. But you're welcome to ask questions at the end. And I do want to say at the outset that when you're dealing with history, Israel, especially the Arab-Israeli conflict, there are 2 stories. All right, so let's begin. So you can see the questions that we're going to deal with today. First thing I'm going to do, and really in just quite an entertaining kind of way, we don't have time to go through all of Jewish history, but it sounds like a crazy question. What is the Jewish people's historical connection to Israel-Palestine? And you know, I just sort of finished saying that, you know, the other valid question to that is what is the Arab and Palestinian connection to Israel-Palestine? We won't have a chance to do a lot of that today. Who has the strongest claim to sovereignty over Jerusalem? To say it in a shorter way, who actually owns Jerusalem according to international law? And the last thing, I'm sure you've heard this a lot if you've been following the American administration and politics all in the last couple of years, is, you know, we have a great solution. It's called the 2-state solution, and my question is, well, is that a reasonable solution for all the parties involved? Is that a reasonable solution for peace? Is that a reasonable solution for Israel? So in all the courses and material, I always try and bring in I try and focus on critical thinking. You know, one thing about Israel is, you know, and the Middle East is you're going to the core of people's identities and their aspirations. And sometimes, you know, that can cloud the things that people say. So you want to make sure that your mind is engaged, and you're going to see why in a second. So critical thinking is a big part of the things that I do. And I'm going to show you an example of it here. All right, so we're going to start with the first question, Israel-Palestine, what is history? Most of us would like to believe that historical writing is true, right? Unlike, let's say, creative writing, where, you know, sometimes it's true and sometimes it isn't true. It may be based on life experiences. And the reality is that, you know, history sometimes isn't always the truth that we'd like it to be. And so, you know, when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict, history actually has become part of the conflict, the writing of history and the recording of history. I'm going to show you an example. And one thing I also want to say about this presentation is any positions I show you here today are never, heaven forbid, meant to disparage the other side. Okay, that's really not how I teach. I'm just trying to present to you some things so that you can actually get an accurate reflection, and sometimes they're not always pretty. Okay. So here's the some of the a Palestinian Authority historical claim regarding the Temple Mount. We're going to look at two different historical claims.
أنا أعرف أنها مقدس فيها مقدسات إسلامية ومسيحية. لا أعرف فيها مقدسات يهودية. إسرائيل بدأت بحثيات منذ عام 67 للبحث عن آثار لهيكلهم أو لتاريخهم.
Just out of curiosity, how many people think that the claim that he's making, okay, which is in a sense that the Jewish people have no historical connection to the Temple Mount, how many people think that that's true? Okay, interesting. Okay, so nobody put up their hand. Just hold on to that thought for a second. Again, I said at the outset that the goal here isn't to disparage anybody. This just happens to be the position of the Palestinian Authority for the most part. Their clerics, this person is the second highest ranking Palestinian cleric, who was when he made this comment, in the Palestinian Authority, second only to the Grand Mufti. Okay, so, but this is the position that they take. So the question, you know, what evidence is there to support his claim? It's a historical claim. Are there any grounds for it being true? All right. I'm sure you'll recognize the site. People recognize it, right? It's the Temple Mount in the old city of Jerusalem, or the Haram al-Sharif in Arabic. On the Temple Mount itself, lasers. Okay, well, we're not going to do the laser, so you just have to, you can see the square area. How many holy sites can you, what holy sites can you identify on there? Yes?
The Western Wall.
Okay. Is that actually on the Temple Mount, or is it adjacent to it? It's on the perimeter, right? Okay. Open this up.
Works for a second.
Yeah, you know what? I think it's actually not the battery because I just changed it. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Okay, so, you know, people recognize that gold dome structure because if you get a postcard of Jerusalem, that's popular, one of the most popular landscapes that you'll see. So that is the Mosque of Al-Aqsa, the Dome of the Rock, okay? And then if you come down towards the bottom right of the screen, on what would be the southern end, okay, is the Mosque of Al-Aqsa, right? Do you see a Jewish temple on that site? No, right? So the wall, I'm sorry, I don't know everybody's name, but the wall that was just mentioned, the Western Wall, adjacent down on this lower side, you know, that's commonly identified as a Jewish holy site. In Islam, that is the Al-Barak Wall. Okay? In the Quran, in Surah 17, it actually talks about a night journey that their prophet Muhammad made, and that's where his animal is tied. So in that picture, if you're looking just at the facts on the ground, I mean, we'd have to say that right now there are two Islamic holy sites sitting on the Temple Mount, and there doesn't seem to be any Jewish temple. Would that be fair to say? Okay, so right now, if you look at present time, there is some evidence supporting this claim. So this is a map put out by the United Nations. It's called map number 229. I actually got this directly from their archives. And what you can see on the Temple Mount are two green dots on the Temple Mount. Adjacent to it are the green and the blue dot, the Western Wall and the Al-Barak Wall. And you can see that the international community also thinks that the Temple Mount area is an Islamic holy site. Okay, there is no Jewish temple marked on that. Hopefully this comes back to life. There's no Jewish temple on that spot, or nothing identified as a Jewish holy site on that spot. Okay? Now, you know, normally I would do an interactive session, but I have so much stuff I want to cover with you guys today. I'm going to actually, because it's interesting. you know, I asked you if you thought that was true. How many people still think that the claim that we don't have a historical connection, we mean the Jewish people, to the Temple Mount area is true? Nobody. Okay? You know what? We don't have a lot of time, but just for the sake of, how many people think they can refute it with evidence? Refute to Mimi's claim. What evidence is there? Yeah, one quick one. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That in the Roman, like, historical archives, they note that they burned the temple down. And
Okay,
that's
can you,
what-
where is it?
In Italy.
Sorry?
I think in Italy they have archives. They have archives from the Roman time where they documented that they burned the temple to the ground down there.
Okay, so I would need a source, like an exact source. Right?
I can't give a great number.
Okay.
The Temple Mount itself was built by the Jews to hold the temple.
What are you basing that on?
We never-
Sorry, I hope you don't mind. I'm not picking on you, but I hope
built it.
you're basing it on a story or basing it on the evidence that you see on it. How do you know that?
From this, I guess, but from what I read in my history books, like in Europe, the Temple Mount and stuff were.
Okay, but there isn't any evidence left now to prove, right? So I hear what you're saying. So just, yeah, I hear you. I'm not picking on you, by the way. We're just going to go through it. Okay, we'll take one more and then we should.
In Rome,
Yeah.
the Romans typically celebrated victories by creating monuments. And in Rome, there's a monument, the Arch of Titus, which has a relief on it graphically depicting the destruction of the temple.
Okay, is it depicting the destruction of the temple?
No, specifically, no. It's taking out the ornaments from the temple.
How do you know that?
Because we know archaeologically that the candelabra that they're carrying.
Okay,
was
good.
the one.
So I only brought that up. We didn't have a lot of time to do that in depth, but I just wanted to show you, and you know, nobody should feel bad about this, by the way. I do this talk a lot in front of thousands of people. I was telling Ari beforehand, for every 1,000 people that I teach in front of, when I ask for evidence that would refute the claim that we don't have a historical connection, I might get 1 in 1,000 people who actually have some grounds for reasons why they should believe that we have a connection, other than our history, right? Because we want to base our history on something. It's just an interesting fact. By the way, I didn't know either. Okay, when I put this presentation together, and I first heard the claim, and it surprised me, actually embarrassed me, how long it actually took me to figure out, well, what is there in support of our claim? So here is a little bit of the story and the evidence. According to Jewish history, okay, our historian, we had a temple on the Temple Mount. The picture is not authentic, it's a painting. And it was destroyed, as you mentioned, by the Romans. And is that history? According to the Torah, we had a temple before that one was destroyed. It was destroyed centuries earlier by the Babylonians. Okay? According to our history, it was on the same site. And is that history? The further back you go, the harder it gets, right? To prove. So we now have 2 competing historical claims, right? And we know they both can't be true. If one is true, the other must be false. So the question, we know there's tangible evidence to support the claims that Tamimi and the Palestinian Authority are claiming, because there isn't a temple there and there are Islamic holy sites there and have been for a long time.
Can they prove that those were holy sites?
Pardon me?
But can they actually prove that those weren't distorted by history by the exact same way that this was? And that those were built
Well, if we go by present day in the last number of centuries, the evidence seems to be sitting on their side. The tangible, right? So the question is there tangible evidence to support our claim? And for me, the question was, well, what should count as evidence? I teach law and philosophy, and these are subject areas where you've got to make a reasoned defense of a claim. Like whatever claims you're going to be making in a paper or whatever in a court of law, they have to be backed up. They have to be supported. So, I sat back and I categorized the types of things that people generally accept as evidence. And not everything is for a court of law. philosophical, and I broke them into categories. We're not going to go over the details of all of them. Like I said, there's material that you can get afterwards that will explain all of them. But just to give you an example, the first category, personal observation, people generally will accept things that they see and hear themselves, right? And this is how we live our lives and how we navigate the world. So I should point out that none of these categories are infallible, right? Sometimes people see and hear things and they make mistakes, right? And that's just the way it is. But the bottom line is we have to have something to go on. We have to have something to act on. And these are the categories. So tangible objects, documents. You go to buy a pair of jeans at the Gap, for example. You don't like them. So you decide 4 days later you want to take them back. And the clerk there then says, well, I'm sorry, I can't accept these. They're not from our store. And you say, well, but I have a receipt. Oh, sure. Then, well, you have a receipt. You now have a document, evidence that you purchased it here. Okay. So I'm going to use these categories to make something that I call a hysterometer, a meter for measuring historical truth, or how we measure a claim. You can use it for other things also. And we're going to apply it to the claims, whether the question that I asked earlier, is there evidence to support the Jewish claim that they have a historical connection to the Temple Mount? Okay, so people are familiar with what the Talmud is, right? We have a written hist in the Torah. It's supposed to be the written part of our guidebook, and then there was an oral law that also was put down in paper, and there's lots of stories, 7,000 pages of various things in there. So there's a story in the Talmud, our oral laws, that makes reference to a character in history by the name Titus. Okay, and it's talking about a story. It doesn't really matter the details what the act of profanity was. He committed an act of profanity in what is the Holy of Holies. It's a story in the Talmud. Okay? Does that prove conclusively now? Do we have supporting evidence that we were on the Temple? No. Okay. But we now have another historian who lived at the time of the Roman destruction of the Second Temple, Josephus. He has a very thick work of history. Most scholars accept his historical accounts. His descriptions of sites are very accurate. Even today, you go to the sites where the things that he's describing, and they're quite accurate. He actually talks about the Roman siege as a personal observer, right? Even though it was thousands of years ago, he's writing it from his eyes of what happened. And he talks about the destruction of the temple. And you can go find the source yourself, should you choose. All right, so now we have the Talmud with a story about this general Titus. We have Flavius Josephus talking about this character Titus in his works now, right? And corroborating the Talmudic story a little bit. And as the gentleman in the back mentioned, right? In Roman history, in Rome, we have an artifact, a commemorative arch called the Arch of Titus. Okay? And on the inside of that arch, you can go see this today, by the way, is an engraving on the inside of the arch. And it seems like there's a Jewish artifact there. So my question was, well, why do I associate that with a Jewish artifact? I mean, it's almost Hanukkah coming up soon, but and most Jews do associate this artifact with Jewish history, Jewish theology. The question is why? What makes this? Why couldn't this shape be any number of people's history? Right? How do we know this is an engraving of some other victory? And we don't conclusively, but you know what we have. And this isn't the only place, by the way, is in our Torah. We have a description of a temple artifact in the book of Exodus, which talks about, 6 branches, 3 from each side, the shape of the place where you put the candle up at the top. And that's now becoming fairly coincidental. And it's doing a number of other things, right? Even biblical skeptics of when the Bible was a completed entity, who wrote it, so on and so forth, generally acknowledge that it was a done deal around the 3rd, 4th centuries before the Common Era. Why do they know that? Because it was translated into Greek at that time, so now it's not just in Hebrew, all right? It's now also in another empire's history. And so you've now taken, even if you don't believe, the ancient, go further in the Bible than that, that, you're now anchored back 2,500 years. You're also anchored back, 500 years or so, approximately, before the Romans even showed up to have this destruction of the temple. So we couldn't have wrote it afterwards, right? And now you have a number of these different things all coming together in terms of tangible evidence. Okay, the burnt house. So there is a site just meters away from that Western Wall area that you can go visit in trips to Israel. And basically this is an excavation dated back to the Second Temple period. And it's I think 6 meters, it was 6 meters under the ground. There's layers of ashes, and in it are a number of different artifacts. Coins dating back to the time of the Roman occupation, all right, and the destruction of the temple, and no coins later than that date, by the way. So it ends there, all right? And, also we've got, ashes, which, corroborate the idea of a big fire, and also is a stone weight with the inscription of a name Bar Cuthros on it, who is described in the Talmud as a priestly family. They're not described in the most flattering of terms, but the bottom line is now you have a whole bunch of other things being pulled into the equation also. All right. Interestingly enough, though, if you go to Islam, pre this period, just go back about, I'm a mathematician, 85 years, in 1925, this guide was put out by what was the Supreme Muslim Council, headed by a guy who was no friend of the Jewish people, Hajj bin al-Husseini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem at the time. And in this book, on page 4, it talks about the Haram al-Sharif, which I told you was the Arabic name for the Temple Mount. And on the bottom of the guide, it actually says that the Temple Mount, what they call it, that site's identity with Solomon's temple is beyond dispute. Now, what's interesting about that, Islam takes the position that all of the Jewish prophets are basically prophets sent to usher in Islam. But the fact that he notes that there's a temple there, right, is interesting. Okay, that language. Okay. All right. So there is, we have our scholars and commentators on Torah, on Talmud, and, Islam has their scholars as well who look at the Quran and do commentary on it. So this is a scholar whose version of the Quran, the English version of the Quran, is the most widely read English version in the world. And he says, what he's basically doing, he's looking at one of the Arabic verses in the Quran, in Surah 17, that talks about that night journey that I was telling you about. And he says that this word, I guess in Arabic, could refer to these 2 occasions. The destruction of the temple in 586, when the Jews were carried off into captivity, and the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus in 70. Interesting, okay? So you can see that there was a time when this wasn't necessarily the position, and there's just numerous other places where he talks about the Jews and the temple and the different destructions and so on and so forth. Okay, so why I've shown you this is to basically set up what will be the rest of the talk. And that is that, the story that's led us into the situation that we're in today has a long history. And it goes to the core of 2 peoples or people's identities and their aspirations. And sometimes that history is used to serve political ends. And so what I would like to basically invite you to do is that when you read history, whatever claims you hear, if they sound a little bit odd to you, get ready to apply some critical thinking to it, because there's probably more to it than just the surface, right? All right, so after the Roman-Jewish Wars, right, obviously there's a long period of Jewish history from there, but we're going to actually make a big jump, because once the Romans were finished with us, especially about 60 years after, 70 years after what I just showed you, there really wasn't much opportunity for Jewish sovereignty in the region for quite a long time. And then what's really interesting about the way the world works, I mean, sometimes you couldn't write this stuff, you'd think it was just fantasy or fiction, is that, you go for 20 centuries and Then the issue of Jewish nationalism appears, and at the same point in time, there's going to be another people's nationalism who all starts to appear at the same time. And we've got two peoples basically now with national focuses and desires on similar kind of territory. So there isn't really any sovereignty issues with regard to Jewish people because we're quite dispersed all over the world and not very powerful. Until the rise of Arab and Jewish nationalism in the 19th century, when the idea of who's going to be the sovereign over this land called the Holy Land then becomes a big issue in international relations, and it's still an issue today. And so I want to take you through some of these key events, and we're going to go through them quite a bit of stuff fairly quickly. Herzl, I'm sure a name which all of you or most of you recognize, was not actually the originator of what we call modern Zionism. He's just the guy who's most well known, and he was a remarkable guy, no question. But it did start decades before him with other people like Pinsker and Hess, who you can read about. But Herzl really sort of gives, he's the catalyst for what's going to become the political part of the Jewish nationalism, or what we recognize today, it's called Zionism. Now, Zionism is not a new concept, right? I mean, Zion is a synonym for Jerusalem, listed over 600 times in the Torah. It's a name that Jews could see in their prayers, their daily prayers. So the idea of Jews being Zionistic, or that they're being, or Zion being part of our worldview, is not new, but the political elements of it, the secular political elements of it, are fairly modern. Okay? And so, without getting into the, actually let me just look and make sure, I don't remember if I actually put the story of, I left out the story in France of how Herzl actually becomes the, motivated to do this, and you know what, we probably don't have a lot of time for it. What I'm going to do is jump to the Basel conference. I had an amazing opportunity to actually speak on that stage 2 years ago in that exact place. It still exists. The upper back deck is not there anymore. The deck actually starts more down the sides. But it was quite surreal because it really does still look like that. And what happened was in 1897, basically they organized a conference, and these were the aims. Number one, to promote settlement in Palestine, get the Jewish people to move to Palestine, to strengthen their idea of a national entity, a national self-consciousness, and the big thing was to get governments to sanction this, to get governments to stand behind it. You'll see why you need this background. Okay? I know it's starting early in the story, but you'll understand in about 10 minutes, hopefully, why I'm doing the background to this. So how did Zionism go from a nice idea that the Jewish people want to have, we want to go to Palestine, right? Which is what it was called then. How does it go from that to getting some political force? That's a pretty big step. People recognize this name? Okay, so Chaim Weizmann, who, because of his inventions as a chemist and his position in Britain, really became connected with British politicians. And he's the one that moves it forward. He meets a guy named Arthur Balfour, who was the former British Prime Minister, gets him interested in this cause. There's a number of different reasons why. You have to know that nation states always act in their own self-interest. There's a lot of Jews now starting to look to immigrate to Western Europe. It's possible that the British government was just looking for an opportunity to have Jewish people go somewhere else other than there. But also, Balfour seems to be a Christian Zionist. And so you mix these two things together. England has a very strong history, right? You understand the Puritan and the Puritan Revolution, the Reformation, and their move to America, a big part of American ideology. They have a big history with the Bible. Okay, so Balfour is a man of power, and he's going to help him and Weizmann together are going to start to make this known in British Parliament. The Arabs were also organizing politically at the same time. Just it's a strange irony the way the world works, right? This is a picture of the gentleman who was the chair of what's called the First Arab Congress. It took place in Paris in 1913. And they were also looking for sovereignty in the Arabian Peninsula and around. Okay, so The question you should be asking is, well, wait a minute. What do you mean they were looking for sovereignty? That's where they're from, right? I mean, who had sovereignty if they didn't in places like the Arabian Peninsula, in Syria, in Mesopotamia? And the answer is the Ottoman Empire. Now, so I'll do the best I can. Don't get too confused by the map. I know it's in French, I believe. But what I want you to notice is if you look at the orange, the pink, and the purple, those are European colonies, okay, all through North Africa. And if you look at that sort of greenish horseshoe-looking shape, that is the Turkish Ottoman Empire that had really had been the sovereign power in the area that we're going to be talking about for 5 centuries. The yellow part, by the way, nobody really was a sovereign over. It was just very tribal, and it's desert and nomadic and not very hospitable, so people just generally didn't go in there. But the Europeans, like the purple is the British, they had strong interest in the area because of oil. Have people heard of British Petroleum? So it was originally called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Okay? A little bit closer look. So the Arabs did not have sovereignty, and there really never was sovereignty, at least in the modern sense, ever held by the Arab people where they lived. Okay, this is a little bit of a close-up. If you can see, I don't know, it's maybe a little bit fuzzy, but the map on the upper left is that horseshoe. Okay, and the square is actually the more blown-up part. And you can see that the territory that we're going to be talking about, Palestine, Israel, was broken up in the Ottomans in different sections, okay, vilayets, okay, administrative districts. Okay? And there's going to be questions about how far the vilayet of Beirut actually went south. Jerusalem was its own separate entity for whatever reasons. There was a Damascus, there was a Syria, okay, a number of different administrative territories. Okay, so it was the Ottomans that were in control, but that changed as a result of World War I. Okay, so what happened? What happened was the Turkish Empire made the decision to join the losing side, and if they hadn't, had they decided to go the other route, we would likely not be having this conversation today. There wouldn't be an Israel education in the way that I'm doing it here, because I don't know how any of the things that we see today in terms of the borders would have come to fruition the way they did. But the Ottomans joined the side of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and we know what happened. Okay. And a number of things came out of that war that sort of helped lead us to today. One of the big things is the importance of the Arabs, okay, in the region was quite heightened as a result of World War I. Why? Well, take a look at this map again. And you see all the European colonies, and now you see the Ottomans, all right? And you can see that the Suez Canal, where it's positioned, and you can see the Persian Gulf. Again, forgive me, I don't know why my laser is acting up. Temperamental laser. But you can see the purple on the bottom part of the Arabian Peninsula to the right. We all know the oil in the region. So this is a very strategic area. Also for the ports that are there. And you've got Turkey, which falls under what world faith? It's Islamic, right? It was an Islamic empire. That was the site of the caliphate at the time. And you've got the British now with Turkey joining the other side, and they're sitting there going, well, wait a minute, okay? Look at where Turkey is, and if you look at the whole southern part, right? What are the peoples of that area? What's the majority population? They're Arab, right? I mean, it's the Arab people, and there's tens of millions of them now. If you're trying to win a war, right, and you've got a major power sitting there, you can see in green, who is Islamic. The Arab people are primarily Islamic, right? You can see how now, whichever side that people ends up deciding to join, that's going to be a significant advantage in the war. Does that make sense? Whoever they choose, that could be a game changer. And they're smart. And they recognize that, the Arab people do. And they use that position, okay, to basically say, you know what, let's make a deal for ourselves now. And so World War I produced a number of agreements, okay, that are important. And let me show you just quickly what happened during that era. So I said the Arabs realized that they had something, that they were in a position of power that they hadn't been in years. They had been under Turkish oppression for 5 centuries, and they wanted their own autonomy, okay, in the lands that they inhabited. So there was a royal family living in Saudi Arabia. They the Hussein family. They are from the Hashemite clan, right? People follow like the Middle East. Does anybody know who the Hashemites are today? The Jordanian royal family. Okay, so these are the I'm not talking ancestors like ancient ancestors. We're talking like a great grandfathers of the royal family that's in Jordan. Okay, now the Islamic prophet Muhammad was from a tribe, the Quraysh tribe, and the Hashemites were one of those with a clan. So they claimed direct descendants from the prophet. They had a lot of status in the Arab world. Okay, so when the Arab nationalists were getting to the point where they wanted some representation from who would have been their upper authority, they went to this family and they said, this is what we want you to do. We want you to contact the British people and tell them that we will support them in their war effort, but we want sovereignty. Okay? And I'm going to show you the territory. So there was a number of letters called the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence. McMahon is the British High Commissioner in Egypt, and that's who was the contact. And I want you to take a look, again, another map, not the best way, but you can see that top line at the top. It's called the percent and then a line. And then there's very, probably the clearest communication that's ever happened in response of the Arab-Israeli conflict happened in the letter that the Sheriff of Mecca, the King Hussein, sent to McMahon, the British High Commissioner, and what he asked for very clearly defined the boundaries of what they were looking for. Oh, not going to work that way. That's what he asked for. He asked for the Arabian Peninsula. He asked it basically to the Persian frontier. Okay, so that line there where it ends is Baghdad, okay, in modern-day Iraq, down all the way through the whole Arabian Peninsula, up the Red Sea, okay, through the Sinai Peninsula, and then up the coast of the Mediterranean, okay, to that percent and down the line. It was very clear, the correspondence. So what happened? The British High Commissioner, there was a series of exchanges, but ultimately ended up sending back a note that said, okay, you know what, we'll give you what you're looking for. We will support you in your sovereignty aims, except for a tiny little strip. And I don't know if you can see, this is a railway, but just to what would be your left of that line, to the Mediterranean, except for that tiny little strip, because we don't see that as always being completely Arab, right? We accept your proposal subject to that delimitation, right? This is what it looks like close up. Now, if you remember, right, that was the Ottoman sort of districts of Jerusalem and this vilayet of Beirut, okay? So that everything except that is a much bigger space. That we agree that you can be sovereign of, or you create an Arab state there, but not that particular stretch. So a couple of questions you might be asking is, what was such a big deal to them about that particular stretch? Okay, before I answer that question, let me just explain that the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence really has no status in international law for a number of reasons. The British government hadn't won the war. They didn't have the territory when they promised it. First of all, it didn't belong to them. It was Ottoman. And number two, I mean, correspondence in international law, letters back and forth, it's really a promise from a British government. One could say, yes, if they were people of integrity, they would have to honor that if they had the power to do so. But other than that, it doesn't have much status involved. All right, so the question that I asked just before I addressed that was, why do the British need to have that limitation? Why not just give them what they asked for? Well, part of the reason is because the British were holding secret meetings with the French around the same time. Okay? And they were carving up amongst themselves, they had reached an agreement to carve up the territory into different zones. Okay, so some of the zones that each of the powers, like Britain, would have direct control over one of those, they would be in control of it. And the other zone, the lighter, I don't know if you can see the blue at the top, and there's kind of a yellowish at the bottom, that's where it says B zone, and, red zone, okay, direct British control, and blue zone, direct French control, and then there's an A and a B zone where the two powers would have influence, meaning they were prepared to give that territory maybe Arab autonomy, but they would still have some influence, right? But the other zones they would directly control, and you can see why. The red zone is basically the British oil interests. The blue zone, if you're familiar with the Latin Crusaders, I mean, this is a very important territory to the French in history, plus it's ports. Okay, the French want a presence there. The British did not want to upset the French. You know, it's not like they've had the easiest history themselves, right? And now they're fighting a war together. And I don't know whether you can see that little purple area that says Allied condominium at the bottom left. What they were going to do with that Mustafa League of Jerusalem, that Ottoman district, was it was going to be shared by everyone, right? I mean, it's an important religious heritage site, okay? Let's not make any waves, okay? It's important to Christians, okay? It's important to Muslims. Let's just make that, you know, a condominium zone, an international zone. So you see, they had their own ideas about that. So basically, the British had already given the French, they basically, in their conversation with the French, had given them that blue little strip. What were they going to do now, right? We can't give that away. The French are going to be really upset. That's not going to go over well. But that didn't end there, because there was a third agreement that was going on at the same time, a third series of negotiations with the Jewish representatives. So why would the British care that the Jews, I mean, a small population, what do we care what they think? Okay. So I answered that a little bit earlier when I said the British had some Christian Zionist interests. They're biblical people. You know, we think that the Jews need to be returned to the land of Israel in order for Christian theology to come true, right? You know, and there may have been the Jewish immigration thing, that they would rather the Jews go to Palestine than they come into Britain, whatever the reasons are, okay? Those meetings that took place between Chaim Weizmann and Arthur Balfour, I'm sure you've all heard of the Balfour Declaration, ended up becoming a pledge of the British government. And it said this, basically: I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with the Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. This was approved by the British government. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment of Palestine as a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in other countries. Now, there's some important words in here which you may not, maybe you have, maybe you haven't noticed or seen before. Right? Notice the difference in the phrasing. Why does it use the word political rights in one phrase and civil and religious rights in another phrase in regards to different peoples? Okay? So, I don't know whether you know this, but this was not a document that was just like, okay, somebody just write it down and let's make a motion and let's get it done. This was years of back and forth of distilling, and you know, there was, originally it said Jewish state, and then there were a number of Jewish people who thought, no, we can't put Jewish state down. That's going to be too much to ask for. It's going to put us in, we're going to put the people who live in England in a difficult situation. Maybe they'll tell all the Jews to get out. Like, does that happen in our history numerous times? So they use this word national home. What's a national home? That was never used before in history. Okay? But the question, civil and religious rights versus political rights. So the non-Jewish communities are supposed to get civil and religious rights, right? Freedom of worship. Right? You can't have your home bulldozed. But political rights, you don't get a vote. Well, that doesn't necessarily seem fair. But why would they do that? Well, the answer is obvious. I mean, these guys were not dumb. right? They knew who the majority was there. I mean, what's the point of going through an exercise of trying to establish or promise a Jewish national home if you're going to basically turn around and say, okay, majority votes? I mean, what are the chances there's going to be any? It's not going to happen, right? It was an Arab majority there. So the second it went to its first vote, it would be finished, right? What they understood was you need to give this experiment a chance to come to fruition. The Jewish people are scattered all over the world. You can't give political rights to the people who are inhabiting the territory there on an equal level, or the whole thing is just makes no sense. Okay? So, political rights. Now, it refers to political rights enjoyed by Jews in other countries. Okay? I'm just pointing out that it didn't use the word political rights with the non-Jewish community in Palestine. Now, I perfectly am okay if you think that's unfair. I understand, but that's what it said. So, I asked this question earlier with regard to the McMahon-Hussein promises, right? What's the Balfour Declaration in international law? And the answer is pretty much about the same. It doesn't have really any status in international law. It might have a little bit more credibility only because of this. Other nations publicly stated that they would support this, Italy and other allied powers. So now you have a little bit different situation than the other one, but really it does not imbued with a lot of legal attributes. Just a promise, okay? All right, so we're getting to the modern history, and thank you for your patience, but you know, I really can't do a really good job on the modern history until I go through some of this, and you'll understand why, right? After World War I, there was a huge conference in Paris, because the leaders of the world basically thought, what a horror, 60 million people, we can't do this again, right? We have to try and take a different approach. So the US president, I'm sure you remember your history books, tried to organize this League of Nations that would help prevent future wars. You know, wanted to have an initiative that aimed for peace. Now, just prior, and there were tens of thousands of delegates showed up, and it was a land grab, right? You had communities who never had sovereignty over anything in their lives, communities in Eastern Europe who all showed up there from everywhere, right? Trying to get pieces of land that, you know, who knows when this opportunity would ever come again in history, right? And all showed up asking for land. It wasn't just Jewish people, it wasn't just Arab people, it was a whole world population being represented by different groups. Some got it, some didn't. The people that didn't, some of those populations ended up with their own tragic histories. Armenia, okay, for example, the Kurdish people. All right, so just prior to the peace conference, there were a couple of really important meetings, okay? That sheriff of Mecca that I told you about earlier, that royal family, the son is Faisal, the Emir Faisal. And maybe people have heard of Lawrence of Arabia, right? Excuse me. He became friendly with the Emir Faisal, and so he brought him to a number of his meetings. So the Emir Faisal worked out some agreements with Chaim Weizmann. And it's called the Faisal-Weizmann Agreement. I want you to look at the language, because you're going to think, well, wait a minute now. That people actually spoke that way back then compared to what you hear nowadays, right? The two parties, mindful of the racial kinship and ancient bonds existing between the Arab and Jewish people. If only, right? If only we could, right? Realizing the surest means of working out their nationalist aspirations is through the closest possible collaboration in the development of the Arab state in Palestine. Take a look at the last sentence. What do you see in there that should be noteworthy to you? Yeah. Why does it say that? Okay? It doesn't say Arab state. Arab state and Palestine, meaning separate things. Okay? Again, the Arab state and Palestine and all their relations and undertakings are controlled by the most cordial goodwill, right? Immediately following completion of the conference, okay, they'll work out boundaries. Again, it says Arab state and Palestine again, right? Wasn't an accident. And the Arab delegation is going to note that, you know, we understand that what we're trying to create is the pledges of the Balfour Declaration here, a Jewish national home in Palestine, right? So it wasn't like there was a secret. And what that entailed was, we understand there's going to be large amounts of Jews showing up and making delicatessens, okay, and all kinds of things we got, right? So these are the various things that we can conclude. You know, an Arab state was contemplated by the parties. Palestine was not included in it. And the policies of the Balfour Declaration with large-scale Jewish immigration were really part of it. Now, we show up at the peace conference. Really important to understand something about the peace conference. They are the Supreme Court of the world at this time. Their decisions become law, right? And the entire map of Europe is going to be changed based on the decisions they make. They have the power of disposition. In other words, two parties come before a judge, he hears the case, he decides it, that becomes law. This is what Paris was. So you have the Supreme Council, by the way, made up of England, France, Italy, Japan, minor role, and then President Wilson of the United States sitting as the kind of the chair. The representatives of the Zionist organization make their petition before the Supreme Council in February of 1919, and this is what they ask for, okay, in terms of territory. So what you should note about that is where the lines, by the way, are the current borders. There were no borders then, right? This is the current, I just put up current borders. So you can see, you know, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon. You can see that the territory actually extends onto the east side of the Jordan River and also north into Lebanon and what would actually be where the Litani River is, if you know the geography there. Okay? Why would they ask that? Right? Well, one reason might have been that the Hejaz Railway was a natural place to stop. You know, why would we put a railway that the Arabs are going to get really upset about, that they've been using as a major artery? So that's kind of why the shape is probably stopped there, but it's not why it went across the east side. Right? It went across the east side because what the Zionist organization was petitioning for was the land inhabited. Not that this was ever, you know, one thing in history, but in the book of Joshua, area inhabited by the 12 tribes of the ancient Israelites. Okay? So after Paris, anybody know the Harvard School of Law, right? Okay, Felix Frankfurt, right? There was an article printed where the Emir Faisal seemed to go back on his words in a French newspaper. So Frankfurter wrote him a note basically saying, you know, what gives? And he wrote back a very famous note that basically said, you know, this. We, Arabs, especially the educated among us, look deepest sympathies on the Zionist movement. We are fully acquainted with what they want, okay? And we regard them as moderate and proper. We will do our best to help them through. We will wish the Jews a most hearty welcome home. Interesting, right? Just so I don't give distortion to history, because I told you, for me, it's about the truth, not about giving a one-sided story. Not every Arab, part of the Arab community, there were tens of millions of them, was siding with Faisal. Right? There were Arabs who were not okay with what he agreed to, but the major chiefs, right, had approached him, and he was speaking on their behalf. Right? So after Paris, it's important to understand that, you know, you remember from probably your history the number of Treaty of Versailles, Treaty of Trianon, Treaty of Saint-Germain, a number of big treaties happened, okay? And new states were formed, right? Territory was taken away, like the Austrian-Hungary Empire was busted up. There was no Yugoslavia or Czechoslovakia before this time, right? So you got tens of millions of people now becoming new entities, recognized as new peoples. And these border decisions, like I said, were honored and respected. Now, the map of Europe changed, new states were created. What happened to the Ottoman Empire? All right, so this is one of the most important events in Jewish history. I don't know how many people have heard of Saturday. Okay, look around the room. Nobody, right? It's arguably one of the most significant events that happened in Jewish history since maybe the Exodus, right? And you're going to see why, okay? It's in this place, okay? This is a modern picture. It's actually in this place where the Jewish state gets recognized by the world, okay? What happened, okay? This is what it looked like, what it looks like now. This is what it looked like in 1920. Okay? These are the leaders of the same, I mean, some of the names have changed, but the Allied powers are still the same, okay? British, French, okay? Italy, they meet, you know, I'm going to just explain to you what actually happened there, because instead of playing the video, but basically what happened there is Britain and France got mandates, okay, for these newly created areas called Syria, Mesopotamia, which is Iraq, and Palestine. So the mandate basically said, for Palestine, said that Britain is responsible for putting into effect the provisions of the Balfour Declaration, right? And it went farther than the Balfour Declaration. It said, we recognize the historical connection of the Jewish people with that territory and their grounds for reconstituting their country there. The mandatory is responsible for placing the establishment, for creating the whatever administrative entities are necessary to set up the Jewish national home. And they have to facilitate immigration on all lands. Okay, so this is what it looked like, right? So Syria and what became Lebanon went to France. The British got territory which is going to become known as Iraq. These states did not exist in history before. They became sovereign and Arab entities as a result of this conference. And Palestine, can you see the shape of it? Okay. That was a British mandate, okay, allocated for the Jewish national home. Now, in fairness, it's a Jewish national home in Palestine, okay, but we don't really know what that means yet, but that's the size of Palestine. What happened is there was an issue. Faisal, the guy you saw, was supposed to get Syria. The French came in and they said, you know what, we're not okay with that, get out. And his brother, Abdullah, said, okay, we're going to war again. And the British said, we've had enough war, sit tight. And what the British did, and I'm cutting the story short, but what they did is they chopped off all the territory on the east side of the Jordan River, which in one of the provisions of the mandate for Palestine, they could do in emergency kind of situations or at their discretion. And they gave that land, they created another Arab state, really the Arab state of Palestine. They created on the east side of the Jordan River. Okay? And so Abdullah got that, which became Jordan. They moved Faisal to Iraq, and the French stayed in Syria. And West Palestine became what is the source today of quite a contentious dispute. But without micro-focusing, I just want you to see this before we go on. I'm sure you've seen this before. That is basically the Arab world. Okay? So I want you to just keep in mind when we talk about, when we move into this next phase, we talk about partitioning again and the two-state solution, keep in mind the area that we're focusing on. It's that little red sliver, right? All the rest of that, okay, the 12 million plus square miles, okay, the tens of millions of square miles are all Arab sovereign entities right now. Okay? What we're talking about, what we're going to focus on from here, is that one little sliver of land, okay, the 10,000 square miles of territory that became the Jewish state. So, I'm skipping a lot of stuff in the Mandate era. Okay? The Mandate era is characterized by a few things. The Mandate era being from the time Britain took over in 1920, right after San Remo, okay, right up till the Declaration of Independence, right? It's characterized by Jewish immigration, aliyot, periods of a lot of Jews coming in, a lot of violence, Arab resistance and violence, okay, and the British basically reversing their policies, okay, because they got a problem on their hands. It's a much harder job than they thought, in fairness to them, okay? So in 1947, they're broke after 2 world wars. It's been a hard fight. They've had enough, okay? And now they say to the United Nations, you got to take this off our hands, okay? So they partition, right, the United Nations, they send a committee to investigate, and they decide to partition Palestine, okay, the west side, that little sliver that I'm talking about, into an Arab state and a Jewish state. The Arab being the yellow, the Jewish state being the white, okay, this was the proposal, and the area that you can see around Jerusalem was supposed to be that international zone again. It's a World Heritage Site. It was called Resolution 181. It's a General Assembly resolution, not binding, okay, according to international law. If the parties had accepted it, it would have been. I just want you to see how the populations would have broken down based on their divisions, okay? The Arab state would have been 99% Arab, I'm not sure that 1% Jewish would have had a whole lot of luck there, but nevertheless, that's what it was. Okay? The Jewish state was supposed to be about 50-50 in terms of population, so that was going to have over 400,000 Arabs. Okay? So about 55-45. So one's 45-55, the other one 99-1. Okay? And then the international zone around Jerusalem, which was going to be also around 50-50. And the reason why it ended up breaking down that way is there was actually a significant Jewish majority, 100,000 Jews to 60,000 Arabs, but the United Nations felt like that would be a problem to keep that as an international zone. The Jewish people might have a strong claim because in 10 years it was supposed to be a referendum as to which way the territory was going to go, and the Jews had a significant majority. So they said, you know what we have to do? We have to now widen the municipality of Jerusalem to include Beit Lechem and these other Arab towns in order that the population's even on. Okay, so that's how it ended up being 50-50. Why wasn't the partition plan realized?
New York, Friday, May 14, 1948. The United Nations General Assembly is in special session. Opposing the United Nations decision to partition Palestine are the Arab states led by Syria's Faris el-Khoury.
This plan is complicated. It is very hard to implement. It does not it does also have peace. It would lead to bloodshed. There are many difficulties.
The Jewish representatives on the other side are waiting for their hour of destiny. The minutes of Britain's mandate are ticking to an end.
Okay, so what you end up with is the Jewish representatives agree to it, and the Arab representatives reject it flat out. The British pack their bags. Israel declares their independence. Okay. The United States government acknowledges the Jewish state. Interestingly enough, the two other entities, the two other states in the international community that acknowledged Israel were Russia and Poland. Okay, say you couldn't write this stuff. Notice the name on the paper. Okay, Palestine. The name Palestine was associated. Can I ask you just to hold on? I do want to take the question, but back in when Israel, like during the Yishuv, the early settlement period, and during Israel's declaration of independence, during that era, the Arabs were not okay with being associated with the name Palestine or Palestinian, or they thought it was Judaizing, and they didn't like it. So what happened next was a war. Now, you know, in fairness, this looks like, you know, a really organized number of Arab states all got together and attacked the Jewish state. They weren't that organized. It still was a significant threat because who were we, right? I mean, we're outnumbered and at the beginning at least out-artilleried. I just want to show you the territorial
The new state of Israel encompassed 78% of the total land of Palestine. The West Bank came under Jordanian control, and the Gaza Strip under Egyptian dominion.
So I just want to point out to you, so this is from a movie called Occupation 101. Okay? It's not a pro-Israel movie, okay? But so I think it's important to point out, to only take a second, to show that it said under Jordanian dominion. Okay? Why didn't they use the word occupation there? Okay? Because according to international law, that's what it was. It was occupation. I'll just tell you right now. We're going to get to it when we do 67 because we're getting now. You'll understand the background. Okay? You need the law. You need the background. Occupation in international law is the following. It's when a sovereign state takes control over territory that it is not the owner of. Okay? Jordan and Egypt took control over territory that they were not the owners of. By definition, if the person was being fair in Occupation 101, they should have said occupied, illegally occupied by Jordan and Egypt.
Though a truce was declared between Israel and the Arab states, true peace remained elusive, as over 700,000 Palestinian refugees languished in nearby camps.
So this is a truth of what happened in the 48 war. I mean, there are some real tragic sides to it, right? For people who are just family people, right? So basically, there's a dispute of the numbers. To me, I don't really care. 600,000, someone side says 600,000, another side says 725,000. I don't care how you add it up. It's a whole lot of people that were displaced and dispossessed. And you know, if I had to move, if I was out of my home and even went across the street, that would be traumatic, right? So I don't want to minimize what happened and the suffering that people experienced as a result of this war. What I do want to say is that, you know, number one, you can't assign all the blame to one side. Okay, there are a lot of circumstances. We're going to talk about some of them in a minute. But first of all, like, had the Arab representatives accepted the deal, right, why did there have to be displacement like this, right? The Jewish representatives accepted it, right? So you can't blame one side for causing a refugee situation, even though we empathize with it, right? You have to look, these are the circumstances of war. Bullets start flying, what people do if they're smart. This is what I would do. I mean, you hear all kinds of stories. The Arabs were told to leave by Arab representatives. You know, we'll finish this war off in a short time, you'll go back home. We'll be done with these Jewish people, right? Yes, some of that happened. Some of it did, I believe. There were also stories of Jewish people basically pleading, please don't go. Yes, I've seen the posters in Haifa where some of that did happen. Not in every case, okay? There was a strategy that needed to be implemented in the 48 war if they wanted to survive, and the other side was talking about extermination. And you know, not decades after, but days after a Holocaust with a bunch of Jews sitting in displacement camps, that language was something you were going to believe, right? So you acted accordingly. But these people, what I believe happened with the majority of why they became refugees is that who wants to sit in between bullets, want a coffee, shoot, well, right? I mean, you just get out, you take your kids, and you go behind the front lines. That's what people did. And unfortunately, as a result of the war, there wasn't anything to come back to. And I'll tell you why, actually, there wasn't anything to come back to, because when Jordan took over that side, most of those people were content to just stay behind the Jordanian line, all right? So that was a conscious decision. As you noted, there were 160,000 Arabs who did stay in what became the State of Israel, and if you know the numbers today, they make up over 20% of the population, over 1 million Arab Israeli citizens. I'm not saying that life is perfect for them there, but it's a whole lot better than it is for Arabs in other states, for many Arabs in others, the vast majority. That's why they don't leave. Okay. Now, the other side of this story, I just want to do this really quickly, is the story about Jewish refugees. Right? The 800,000 of them that also got displaced to their home out of the 48 war, who were kicked out of communities where they've lived for some of them 2,500 years, since probably the Babylonian exile, if you're talking about Iraq and Baghdad. 135,000 Jews, that's a big Jewish community, right? And if I don't have time to go through the numbers, but if you look, I mean, tens of thousands of Jews living in places now where there are zero in North Africa and in other places in the Middle East. All right, so what happened after the 48 war? There was an armistice agreement, and now we're getting into the modern stuff, and you know, probably you want to pay attention if you want to understand what where we're getting to with this whole two-state thing. The parties, Israel and the Arab states, meet, and they come to an agreement of where the line's going to be to stop the fighting. It's a truce line. It's not a boundary or a border. It just says, if you don't cross this line, we won't shoot you. We agree not to fight anymore if you stay behind this line. Right? And that line has come to be known as the Green Line. Now, the provisions of that agreement state specifically, it's not to prejudice the party's interest in the future. It's not a border, right? So it's important to understand that, because the United Nations and the international community has made this a sacred line as the defining line for the borders that are supposed to happen in this two-state situation. Now, important to understand, should that green line become the border, okay? And I'm going to show you a clip later of President Obama making the statement, you know, 2 states based on the pre-67 border. Now, it does say with land swaps, but just so you know, pre-67 borders, the old city of Jerusalem is not in Israel, okay? That's not there. It's on the other side. Most people don't know that, right? Maybe you did. So let's say for the next 20 years, okay, it's relatively status quo, and then we have the 6-Day War. Now, interesting point, something you should take note of. You know how the world basically makes the claim of, if it wasn't for the Israel creating Jewish settlements on the east side of the West Bank, then we'd have had peace a long time ago. So I want you to take a look, and again, forgive me, I don't have the pointer's not working. But you remember that purple I showed you, right? I want you to take a look at what it says Judea, Samaria. Okay, that's the territory known as the West Bank. By the way, why is it called the West Bank? It's on the west side of the Jordan River. It never had that name before in history. It just, they said West Bank, right? That's the area, right? How many Jewish settlements are in that orange area that you can see in the West Bank? It's part of Jordan where those blue arrows are pointing. How many Jewish settlements are in there in 1967? Anybody know?
0.
Nothing. 0, right? So Golda Meir would say, don't tell me settlements are the issue. Because if settlements were the issue, why did there need to be a war in 67? Why did the Arab people basically instigate a war? Because there were no Jewish settlements there. If that's all they wanted was that land, they had it. We didn't go fighting for it. So interesting point to remember when the settlements come up, right? In 67, there were no settlements, and they started a war anyway, right? And, you know, however things work out, right? You see the land that we had before? Well, that's the land we ended up after the war. And now we have a situation on our hands, okay? Because now, you remember, there's like how many 100,000 millions of Palestinian Arabs living in the West Bank that are now under Israeli administration. And that's an issue. So the world community came out with a resolution that basically said, very famous, 242, Israel has to withdraw from occupied, now the word occupation, first time it's ever used, never used with Jordan, never used with Egypt. Why now? Okay? Israel has to withdraw from occupied territories. It doesn't say all the territories, by the way. It says occupied territories. But they're entitled to secure boundaries and to live in peace. So the question that comes up is, the Arabs now say, when you withdraw from all the occupied territories, we will recognize your secure boundaries and there will be peace. Israel says, wait, now, when we have recognition by you that there is such a thing as a Jewish state, and we have peace, right? Then we will talk about withdrawal from some of these sticky areas, right? So you see this is written, the term constructive ambiguity. It was written by a Brit named Lord Carradine, and it was written this way intentionally, as many legal contracts are, for the parties to work out the differences. But you can see the problem. And the issue with why it's now called occupation. Now I have a question for you, okay? You saw me go through that whole history and all that stuff, and like, oh, we need to know about the First World War, what do we need to know about that stuff for? We were interested in 1967 to 1987. Here's a question for you now, right? Why do I have the word occupied in those quotation marks? I'll ask it a different way. Can you be the occupier according to being an illegal occupier? Remember the definition I told you in international law? You are in control of a territory you don't own. Can you be an illegal occupier of a home that you have title to? Is San Remo true? Did the international community, according to international law, grant the Jewish people all the territory on the west side of the Jordan River? What's the proof of that? They chopped off the part that they could, right, that they had allowance for under the provisions of the mandate, and gave that whole east side already the creation of an Arab state. right? So what's the west side? The west side is, in my opinion, by deduction, that is the Jewish national home in Palestine, because the provisions were very clear on the mandate. The west side was not touchable. You couldn't do, if it was touchable, they could have just given the whole thing to the Arabs and been done with the problem in the first place. Why didn't they? Right? And the answer is because, according to international law, in my opinion, that's the territory that there was no gray area about. So if that's true, how could they be an occupier? You understand my question? By definition, international law, international humanitarian law's definition, how could you be an occupier? Something you own. It's an oxymoron. Okay, Yom Kippur War comes around. We almost lose everything. Big game changer. Why? The Arabs now, huge oil power, oil exporting power in the world. And, you know, again, they're smart, as anybody should be and would be if they were in the same position. You know, you're trying to use your power to get your way, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? So you start to see them turn the tap down, okay? And foreign policy changes, Japan, okay? Britain, even Canada, where I'm from, they basically reverse, right? Canada's an oil, Canada, we have it, right? But Japan, Great Britain, were hugely dependent on Arab oil, right? Now, so basically what happened after 73, and why I put that up is because it was a change of how the Arabs approached the battle, right? Couldn't win in 48. Couldn't win in 67. Now, 67 was a lot different than 48. 48 was a bunch of ragtag, you know, military, paramilitary groups, right? Not heavily armed to the teeth. Wow, 67, whole different ballgame, right? I mean, now you've got 20 years of Russian and American involvement. It's like, it's not kid stuff anymore, right? The time you get to 73, and I'm sure you know the story, I mean, we are that close to it all being over. How it changes, I have no idea, but it did, right? And the Arab psychology is like, you gotta be kidding me. You know, what do we have to do to win a war against these people, right? And so they give up the military strategy and they go a different route, okay? And they have oil, and it's a strong weapon. So they use it, and they use it in the United Nations, and they now start to use the Palestinian people also, right, in their diplomatic initiative to get that full Arab hegemony, right, in what is the Islamic and Arab Muslim heartland, right? So they realized the Palestinians could be, hey, this could work. They could be a pawn, right? For the first time, they recognized the Palestinian leadership, right, as legitimate, as a spokespeople for the Palestinian people. Character by the name of Yasser Arafat appears in history, and the United Nations, Arab oil money is big, and it buys a lot of votes, right? So the PLO gets granted a status faster than any entity has in the history of the international community. So they get granted legitimacy by the United Nations, and things begin to change, right? There's a famous resolution called the Zionism is racist, it's racism, and it's apartheid. This is the first time, by the way, the first time the apartheid label is associated with Israel and the Jewish state. It comes from the UN, right? Now, they rescinded it later, right? But, you know, if you've ever read it, and you should take a look at it, it's quite unbelievable. I mean, it's, one more black mark on the United Nations. But they basically say this unholy alliance with South African apartheid, right? And while all this is going on, remarkably enough, Egypt and Israel are having some negotiations for peace, and they reach a peace, okay? And that starts a paradigm called the Land for Peace paradigm. And because of that, settlements that are being built in the West Bank become a target. Wait a minute, it's land for peace. You can't be building there. How are we going to give that land up, right? I mean, you're using up the land that we have to negotiate for peace, because that worked with Egypt. I mean, this is a strategy we have to use with the rest of the negotiations, right? Settlements now become an obstacle for peace. And the Knesset, I I guess in the time of Begin, when they had, you know, much more assertiveness than we seem to have now, basically said, you know what, I can see where this is going. We're annexing Jerusalem. Well, the international community didn't like that very much. Okay, so another resolution basically talking about how that annexation, you know, was a complete violation of the Geneva Convention. How was it a violation? Okay. All right, so that's another discussion about international law. And this is kind of speaks to a question I asked you earlier. Could Israel validly claim sovereignty over Jerusalem and the Old City? Well, it depends if you believe San Remo or not, right? I mean, that's why that story is important. Why you have to understand the mandate for Palestine. You need to understand the international law process. Because if it's true, then why is there even a discussion? It's not even open to debate. All right, so we have the 80s now characterized by two things. You know, the Arab world was not happy with Egypt. You know, why are you making peace with these people, right? And so you have a number of different, you know, dynamics going back and forth. Peace initiatives, and as soon as there's some progress, met by violence on the other side. We don't want there's a big party on the other side that doesn't want peace. You know, our goal is Arab hegemony, right? There is no Jewish state here. I mean, that doesn't work for us. So wherever you see peace progress, you're also going to see violence. You still see it today, right, from Hamas, right? So in 1991, there's a conference that really starts to change, again, the game. A number of leaders meet there, and that ends up leading to a number of peace plans, the names of which a lot of which you'll recognize: Oslo in '93, and Camp David, and the roadmap that we're kind of in today. And I need to talk about Camp David for a little bit, because Israeli policy from 1967, from the time they took over that West Bank, remember that territorial exchange, all the way up to that Camp David summit just 13 years ago, all focused on the same kind of objective thing, right? Their Israeli policy was basically trying to do two things. Number one, we have to avoid having some kind of control, government over this population. They recognize that's not going to go over very well. But we also have to avoid returning to these 1967 lines, pre-1967 lines. Okay, and I'm going to show you graphically why this is so important later, right? And so Israel didn't annex this territory because they didn't want to govern millions of Palestinian Arabs there. They didn't want it. They didn't want it. But what else are we going to do, right? We can't go back to those lines. So, through a number of different peace negotiations, through the Camp David Accords that ended up resulting in the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, you know, Sadat, the Arab president, basically one of his conditions was Palestinian autonomy, but Begin was no. I mean, autonomy, yes, but state, no, no state. That's what Egypt asked for. It was the same with Yitzhak Rabin. Okay, they didn't do it because they knew they couldn't go back to these lines. They couldn't create an Arab state there, right, in the West Bank, and it was indefensible. Right? Under current terms. You know, if we were just fighting with, you know, I don't know, slingshots and bows and arrows, maybe we could talk about it, but not with the kind of artillery we're talking about now. Right? And so what the basic plan was for most of these leaders, there were two plans that came out. One's called the Alon Plan, and one the Bailey Plan. And the ideas from those plans ended up forming the basis of what the Oslo Accords, which is a strategy that's kind of still in place now, where the West Bank was broken into different sort of territories. What are these territories? They're still labeled this way, by the way. I don't know. Have any of you been to Israel and seen like a checkpoint that has a big red sign on it that says Area A? That no, you know, unless you have authority to go in there, it's punishable. Like it's a criminal act, right? Area A basically gave exclusive control to the Palestinians. That's all that brown territory, because I know you won't be able to read on that. Okay. Why was this plan set up this way? Because Alon and Bailey saw that the vast majority, like 90% of the Arab Palestinian population lived around these major areas, Jenin, Nablus, which is Shechem, right? And so they basically said, look, the bulk of the community lives in just small parts of the West. Let's give them autonomy, all right, as a start, okay? And then we'll see where it goes. This is kind of our, you know, we'll give in a little bit and see what happens. Will this lead to peace? So area B, where there were a number of settlements, like Jewish, was split joint Palestinian and Israeli control. So Palestinian police force, Jewish police force, Israeli police force. Area C remained under Israeli military administration. Okay? You might ask, well, why? Why do that? Okay? I'll show you why in a second. Okay? But basically, it's because Israel had, and you'll see graphically why this is, but Israel had to maintain control of key security areas. I'm not going to spend too much on this because I'm going to show you a picture which will be more graphic. Meaning, the goal was, you know, we have to have defensible borders without governing this large population. Now, what happened? Okay? I mean, you can read it. I'm not going to read it. But basically what happened is Camp David 2000. Ehud Barak, who's the Prime Minister of Israel, comes to, you know, on Bill Clinton, former President Clinton's urgings. You know, it's the end of his administration. I don't know what the, what's the word I'm looking for, what the, you know, strong passion is for U.S. presidencies to be the one that solves this age-old dispute. But Clinton's coming to the end of his day. He's going to have to try and solve this before my time is done, right? He brings Barak and Yasser Arafat to the negotiating table, and Ehud Barak basically says to Yasser Arafat, the West Bank, it's yours, okay? What he says, like 96% of it. There was a tiny little land swaps, okay, like areas of East Jerusalem that were built up and so on and so forth. Why? Well, this is what the popular belief is by people who studied this or who were there. Barak wanted to basically out Yasser Arafat. He wanted to show his true intentions. He doesn't want the West Bank. He wants all of Israel. Watch what happens when we give him what he wants. He's going to turn it down. And that's exactly what he did. Okay? He turned it down. And Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia was published in a magazine, The Atlantic, I believe, saying the following thing to Arafat. Sir, if you turn down this deal, you will have committed a crime against the Palestinian people, right? But he did turn it down. His chief negotiator, Arafat's chief negotiator, basically said afterwards that it wouldn't have mattered if Barak had offered him all of Israel, except for the Temple Mount area. He would have turned it down because he wasn't going to be the guy in the Arab Muslim world that gave up Sunni Islam's third holiest site to the Jewish people. Okay? You have to understand that this is not so much about land as it is about land. It also has a lot of ideology in it, right? And the Temple Mount is the bone of contention, right? Which is why I showed you at the beginning why we started with that whole thing. Hopefully now some of this stuff is starting to make sense, and why I put you through all that talking that I did, right, and started there. Because if you don't have that, you can't make the connection why we're in a difficult situation today. All right, so the ploy worked. He outed Arafat, but you know what? He, in my opinion, made arguably the biggest mistake in diplomatic relations with regard to Israel in probably our modern history. Yeah, it worked, but he locked us into a paradigm now. Oh, they're prepared to give up the West Bank, right? Nobody, I told you, no Israeli leader had said that before, right? So the West has basically jumped all over that, right? The international community, U.S. foreign policy, West Bank, right? The armistice lines, the pre-40, right? The 48 line, that's the border. Look, they were going to give it up. Barak said, "I'll give it. Here, it's yours. As long as you do that, we'll have peace." That's been the negotiating strategy ever since. So what we have to do is decide whether that strategy, and we're going to end on this last little bit, and I appreciate your patience. I know we're going to end on whether that strategy has any chance for either peace or Israel's survival. Okay? It's called the two-state solution. Now, if you listened before...
The only resolution is for...
Sorry. I'm going to run that back. I just need a drink before we go on. Just a little sip. What I was saying is... well, you know what? When you get to be my age, pause like that, your train of thought is gone, you know? The advantage of it is... get to be my age, you can plan your own surprise parties. Okay. The two-state solution. Let's just go with that, and let me show you what that means and what that entails.
The only resolution is for the aspirations of both sides to be met through two states, where Israelis and Palestinians each live in peace and security.
Now that's where it started, okay? But it went further than that.
The United States believes that negotiations should result in two states with permanent Palestinian borders with Israel, Jordan, and Egypt, and permanent Israeli borders with Palestine. We believe the borders of Israel and Palestine should be based on the 1967 lines with mutually agreed swaps, so that secure and recognized borders are established for both states. I am aware that these steps alone will not result.
So I'm just going to skip ahead. Secure and recognized borders. Okay? Peace. Two states. Is that true? Is that a reasonable expectation? So first, okay, we have to ask, okay, critical thinking, is the two-state solution really the Palestinian Authority's goal? Okay? And, you know, I don't know. But this particular ad that came out in National Geographic in the UK, you can't see it, I don't think, but it says, Palestine is lying in the second paragraph right here. Palestine lies between the Mediterranean coast and the Jordan River. Okay? All right. This is a Travel Palestine ad, right? And it's all the cities. When you see them mentioning Jerusalem, it's all of Israel. Okay? But let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Okay? And let's assume for the time being, yes, that's the goal. That's what they want. They want just a state, and there will be peace. Okay? So I don't know if you saw Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech to Congress in 2011. I can't remember the date off my head. 2010, 2011. It's just a short time ago, right? So he basically pointed out, well, what he did. I mean, it was a kind of a, it was kind of like a cold communication between him and Obama back then, if you remember the body language and you saw it, right? But Netanyahu basically addressed directly the Obama administration's Middle East policy with regard to where the border should be, all right, with this two-state solution, and also the right of return. So with your permission, I'm just going to read these excerpts. In recent years, Israel withdrew from South Lebanon and Gaza. But we didn't get peace. Instead, we got 12,000 rockets fired from these areas on our cities, on our children, by Hezbollah and Hamas. So if Israel simply walked out of the territories, meaning the West Bank, okay, the flow of weapons into a future Palestinian state would be unchecked. Missiles fired from it could reach virtually every home in Israel in less than a minute. I want you to think about that. Imagine that right now, we all had less than 60 seconds to find shelter from an incoming rocket. Would you live that way? Would anyone live that way? Well, we aren't going to live that way either. The truth is that Israel needs unique security arrangements because of its unique size. Israel on the 67 lines would be only 9 miles wide, okay, up near Netanya, right? I'll show you a picture of it in a second. So it's absolutely vital that Israel maintain a long-term military presence along the Jordan River, okay, so weapons don't flow into that place. And solid security arrangements on the ground are necessary, not only to protect the peace, they're necessary to protect Israel in case the peace unravels. And you know, he also said in that talk, you know, if you remember, because in our neighborhood, the peace today may not be the peace tomorrow. You don't even know who's going to be in power the next day, right? Okay, are there grounds behind his claims? Or is this just, you know, good drama to not do anything you can to avoid being the nice guy and make this trouble go away?
The government hoped that evicting some 9,000 Israelis from the Gaza communities would improve security. Instead, Israel got war.
In exchange, we got more missiles launched at Israel.
proposed. What I'm saying, two states, not two states, it needs to address these unique security needs. You remember that small sliver of land, okay? It's going to get even more dramatic in a second, okay? How many people have been to Israel? Almost everybody, okay? You know the topography, right? There is a small coastal plain, and then there's foothills, and it starts to rise, right? Until you get into the Judean hills, right? Now, along that coastal plain sits 80% of Israel's population, their industry, their power stations, airports, okay, ports, so on and so forth, okay? And you can see in the picture on the right that as you move outside, so the 9 miles, if you look up, is up near Netanya, right? Okay? You've got some topographical security considerations, right? So it's one thing, I'm just showing it to you in diagrams, and then I'm going to show it to you in actual, real pictures, right? You have to take into consideration not just the size, but also the way the land is there. So what you can see in the distance is Tel Aviv, okay? And that's seen from the foothills. You know, I remember when I was in Israel, I was driving on a train, I said, wow, the mountains, and one of the Israelis laughed at me. Mountains, you have mountains, we have hills, right? But they've got some height to them, right? Okay, so a little closer up, right? This is what Tel Aviv looks like. The telephoto lens, so maybe that's 12, 13 kilometers, okay? To put that in terms here, right? When I came from, 528 down the highway, is it 417 or whatever, that road that took me up here, right? That's 12, 14, that's the distance we're talking about, right? Okay, that's how far away we are. We're not talking about, you know, someplace like 100 miles away, right? Okay, so that's what it looks like. Now that is an Arab village. That would be in the Palestinian state. That would not be under Israel's control. And you can see the population center that's sitting there, and there's a height situation there, okay? Now, sorry for the graphic image. I'm not trying to be propagandistic, but you know, a lot of missiles come from Gaza. And if you don't have these unique security considerations, that is not, I mean, look, I'm brutal when it comes to shooting stuff. I could hit that, right? There's nothing really that's a no-brainer because of the way the topography is, right? There's some serious strategic advantages there. How would you ever check that? You know, I don't care what Iron Dome you have, there's a limit to how much you can stop things, right? That's the Hadera power station, seen from what was a dismantled settlement by the Sharon government in 2005. That would not be part of Israel, right? People land at Ben Gurion Airport. You know, I don't know whether you know this, how many people know that there was another airport in Israel, right, north of Jerusalem? Have you seen it? You know, you can still see the runway there. But that area was walled off, okay, as part of Area A, okay? And planes still took off from there for a while until the other side started building structures, like buildings, right, that were higher than, and then they started shooting at the planes in Atarot, that was the North Jerusalem airport, right? You can't, how can you have an airport there? Right? How can you have an airport here? This is shot from what is, I believe, a Jewish, no, this is the same, right? This is actually the Israeli settlement, but they would be dismantled, right? You can't keep that. Right? You can't keep everything. You can have some land swaps, so you have to understand the topography. I mean, how can you fly a plane there? I mean, anybody been to Renana, have friends there? Beautiful area, right? So, again, I wish I had I'll have to walk up. This is Highway 6, okay? This is Kfar Saba. This is the length of your University of Central Florida football field, right? It's basically one side of the street to the other side of the street. One would be Palestine, the other, Israel. How can you possibly defend across a highway? Right? You're talking about one side of 417 and the other side of 417. That's the state boundary, right? Yeah, you can do it as long as the security measures are there, but if that's basically 367 line, you don't have that anymore, right? How much territory was going to be in the land swap before the other side says, wait a minute, no, we're not doing the deal. Because remember, 96%, how can that be? You're talking about huge swaths of land to give away if you're going up that whole side. Looks a lot different when you see it in person, right? Okay, I'm concluding on these right now. Thank you for the... All right, I want to leave you with some thoughts of one of Israel's greatest statesmen, all right? An American, actually. Listen to what she said. People ask about, well, can there be peace, right? And I think she has about as wise an answer as I've ever heard. I wish to say that from the time I came to Palestine as a young woman, we've been forced to choose between what is more dangerous and what is less dangerous for us. At times, we have all been tempted to give in to various pressures to accept proposals that might guarantee us a little quiet for a few months or maybe even for a few years, but that could only lead us eventually to even greater peril. And we're still in that situation, or perhaps in an even greater one. Even the most enlightened of governments, democracies that are led by decent leaders who represent fine, decent people, are not much inclined today to concern themselves with the problems of justice and international relations. At a time when great nations are capable of knuckling under to blackmail and decisions are being made on the basis of big power politics, we cannot always be expected to take their advice, and therefore we must have the capacity and the courage to go on seeing things as they really are and act on our own most fundamental instincts for self-preservation. So to those who ask, what of the future? I still have only one answer. I believe we'll have peace with our neighbors, but I am sure that no one will make peace with a weak Israel. If Israel is not strong, there will be no peace. Okay, so with regard to the two states, I'm going to leave you on this note. I am not proposing a solution, right? It's a complicated situation. I will say this. I do believe that there, and this requires some understanding of basically Sharia law, Islamic ideology. Islam has a concept within its ideology that it can make a truce or peace indefinitely with a stronger opponent, right? And it can be that way for a long time. So you have to consider, I'm not telling you what to believe, all right? You should make your own free will decision. All I'm trying to do is present to you the things that should be taken into consideration. If two-state solution is what the future is going to be, there has to be considerations because a state of Israel cannot survive on a two-state solution that doesn't take into consideration its security needs. And if it gives up that Jordan Rift Valley, which, you know, I didn't show you the border, but basically the border of Jordan of Israel, that big valley, but you get up top of that valley, which would be the Palestinian state. You get up on that high ground, and if you've ever been to places in Jerusalem like Nebi Samuel, or Givat Shaul, which is where Saul's, they say the ruins of Saul's palace are, they overlook the entire city. It's really a significant topographical strategic advantage militarily. So you have to keep that in mind. Those borders, right? You can't have weapons come in. It's not Gaza. We can't defend them, right? Israeli generals have made this point to heads of state for years now. You give this away, there's nothing I can do. I might as well quit my job, right? I can't help you. I cannot defend the state. Okay, so just something to consider. All right, I talked for a long time. I really appreciate your attention. For those who, you know, I want to thank Ari again for organizing this. For those who decided you want to stay, I'm happy to answer questions if we have a few minutes, or stay as long as people want to talk. And
if for anyone who has questions and want to talk to Mr. Bass after the event, you guys are really welcome to stay. Also, this is the book that he wrote. If you guys are interested in purchasing one of these, just let me know. He will be offering it at a discounted rate. Just give me your information after this, and we'll begin the process of getting those books to you. So thank you guys for coming out.
I'm here, so like, thank you for that. Does anybody want to ask anything? We covered a lot of stuff. Please.
There is something I've noticed that's an interesting type of propaganda that I've been reading about. There seems to be a misconception in a lot of the world that reads about the Israeli thing that, like, you know, all the Palestinians want the Jews to die. From what I've read, it's their fanatical and very noisy fanatic groups like Hamas that really want the Jews to be dead. Most Palestinians are human beings, and they're being used by their own people as human shields. So it makes me wonder if maybe you could have peace in Israel and still need to be one state if you can just take the fanatic groups out.
So your question is, if we remove, if we remove the fanatical entities, and we just did that, would there be peace? I don't know. You know, I think that there are a number of Palestinian people who just want, you know, the same things that we all want. Hospitals that they can go to when they're sick, schools that their kids can go to get a good education, a job, you know, an economy that's there, some self-determination. You know, what would happen if we remove the fanatic? You know, so I mean, maybe yes. I just don't. Can you actually remove those elements? I don't know. Maybe. It's a good question. I don't know. Maybe. Please.
Yeah.
Thank you for your patience, by the way. I made you wait a long time.
The population in Jordan is about 65% Palestinian, or at least it was before the Syrian refugee situation. It seems to me, using the UN numbers, that there might be as many as twice as many Syrian refugees living in Jordan now as there were Palestinian refugees, because Jordan has a small population to start with. Are there possibilities now for, as we see the kind of the potential map in the Middle East being redrawn, even Iraq potentially breaking up, are there new opportunities now that were not available before for an equitable solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, I think the possibilities for an equitable solution, in my opinion, have been there like numerous times throughout history. But you know, part of the complication with the one I'm guessing that you're suggesting, maybe in the state of Jordan or something like that, would mean that the Jordanian monarchy would have to be okay with it, and they aren't, generally. So, or get rid of the monarchy, in which case, you know, then you'd have to ask, okay, well, what fills the void? You know, because we have these situations now in Libya, and you know, the scary one that's being fought out in Syria. I mean, you know, I don't know that there's an easy solution. People ask me, well, what do you think they should do next? And my answer is, I don't know. Maybe it's like the Japanese School of Management says, you know, one decision is make no decisions, right? I mean, you know, I don't know that, you know, yeah, play the game Jenga or that sticks game. You pull one more stick out. Who knows if that's the stick that ends up making everything go. You know, I think it's a bold statement to say whatever is happening is kind of working. You know, certainly not working in an ideal way. But I mean, the Palestinian people do have, in most cases, even though the way they're portrayed in the media, they have a lot of basic necessities. Not that I'm saying it's great, right? Israel has had 60 years of relative, compared to our history over, you know, relative peace and growth and prosperity, and you know, I don't know what the answer is. I just know the point that I made. No strong Israel. There's nothing to discuss. You know that saying, you know, if they lay down their weapons, there'll be peace tomorrow. If we lay down their weapons, there'll be nothing to discuss. I mean, so to me, that's ultimately where it has to go. You know, it wasn't a pretty road getting here. No roads like this are. You know, there's always going to be, you know, tragedy, major losses, and you know, sometimes not nice things, even done by us, right? It's not an easy situation, but we're talking about a relatively small window in history of 60-something years, and I don't know where it's going to go. I don't know that to get rid of the monarchy is the right, you know, I have felt all along that really should have been the Palestinian state, but it just didn't come to be, and now I don't know how we do it. I just know that we have to be strong, or there isn't going to be any there's not going to be any relevant conversation about peace, because I don't think we're going to be part of the conversation. So I'll just take some other people's and I'll get back to you. Sorry. No. It's no problem. I'm happy to take as many, but just to give some other people a chance. Bye.
Okay. In one of the videos you showed, the bombing, it's been
The which? I'm sorry?
The bombing. I'm not sure what city it was in. I've seen it several times on Tumblr and different media sources in the Israeli side from the Palestinian side.
Oh, the bombing. That
Yeah,
was
bombing.
Sderot. Yeah, I know you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's
correct,
been shown on different media outlets from the Palestinian side receiving more from Israel. President Obama was ready to go for Syria for using chemical weapons. Why is it okay for Israel to use chemical weapons? And participate in apartheid against African Americans.
So so I understand, because I'm not sure, I just want to understand the question. Is the question, the video that I showed of Sderot, we didn't show the video of the bombings that Israel does. And so that's
Right.
kind of one-sided. And then there was a second question, did it have...
Why is it okay if Obama was ready to go after, the government was ready to go after Syria for using chemical weapons on their
Right.
civilians? Why is it okay for Israel to use chemical weapons on the Palestinian civilians, especially being in such a lower status politically, just the living conditions as well?
Okay, so I'll answer both your questions. So let's address the first one. I don't think I'm not aware of anybody who, talks at all of, this situation, whether the Jewish, whether they're very pro-Israel or very right-wing, that would stand up and advocate, any kind of bombing of any civilian entity. So you're into actually, you'll have to bring me back, and hopefully it'll be when the weather's colder, and I'll do a conversation on just war, because that really is kind of, to me, what you're asking is are these military initiatives that Israel is moving forward on, are they just in any way? I think for me, and it's a much bigger answer, and it's a very good question, and I respect your question. It's a very big topic. I see a difference in quality between a missile or a rocket attack being launched at a civilian population versus you'll forgive me, a defensive measure to try and stop that from happening. I don't see Israel initiating these attacks. I see, that there are tens of thousands of rockets, and I'm not sure that it would be fair, because sometimes people argue, well, Israel's targets seem to hit more on the mark, where the other ones don't. I'm not sure that that's a fair evaluation necessarily on what's justified. So you're right in that I didn't show the other side, but not because I'm trying to hide it. I just pointed out at the beginning that sometimes you can't do justice to both. But I also think, for me, there's a little difference in quality between, a state having to really defend the security of its population, right, of attack, and not like it's the first rocket that came. I mean, there's tens of thousands of these. I mean, you've got really what is a whole population in certain parts of Israel being terrorized for years. I mean, they grow up, they're just constantly under barrage. I mean, I'll tell you a story that I heard, not secondhand, from a woman who has 3 kids who lives in Sderot. She says when Seva Adom, the alert goes off, she has to decide sometimes which kid to pick up. She doesn't have time to, how do you get all 3? What do you do in that situation, right? So, and not that I'm trying to make this one-sided. You also have the other issue of the other side where, I hate to say, but I mean, what seems to me a lack of respect for life, that you fire rockets right in the middle of civilian centers from UN schools, and the UN turns a blind eye to that, from hospitals, right? I mean, so, and you've got an Israeli army basically saying, you know what, our own soldiers, we've got to basically sacrifice our own soldiers because we can't have them shoot in these areas. And at the same point in time, we've got to stop the rockets from coming. So it's such a complicated situation. So I don't know that I would tell it exactly the same way, even though I'm respecting what you're saying. It's not a pretty story, right? But I see the initiations of these different things coming from different places. So now, if people want to take a different view, I totally respect that. Somebody could say, well, if Israel wasn't blockading, if they weren't doing this, then these rockets wouldn't be coming. You know, maybe that's true. And I don't live in Palestine, in Gaza, right? I just know that there's a lot of conflicting stories. And also the leadership there seems in many ways to be not dealing fairly with the majority of the population. There is tremendous wealth in some of these places. And so it's just complicated, and you're left with with what has been a very good business for these radical factions. I mean, let's face it, you know, tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars are flowing in from the EU and from the international community. And yet, where does the money go? To build infrastructure, to get out of this situation? No, it goes to buy thousands of rockets or to buy military, which can then ultimately, it's hard. And you know, you could say the same thing about Israel too, I suppose. But let me, so I don't know if I went on and on about that. Like probably, you know, we would be better, there's a whole chapter, you know, it's a very good question, and it really is a whole topic of just war, and I'm actually very interested in it myself, and I spent a good chunk of the book on that very topic that you're bringing up, because it's a very good question. What justifies either of these sides doing what they're doing? Let me address your second question, apartheid. I gave you a definition for occupation. Apartheid also has a definition. State-sponsored racial segregation, okay? Now, you've been to Israel?
No, I'm Lebanese.
Okay. So, you know, all I can say, and you'll have to take my word for it, I hope that maybe you'll visit sometime and have a look, because it's easier. I don't want you to take my word for this, is what I'm saying, right? Anybody can say anything, right? But if you walk around Israel, right, I'll give you some examples. The old city of Jerusalem, Netanya shopping centers, just to name a couple, right? The entire city of Akko, right? Haifa. You know, I'm just giving you first-hand experience. I'm telling you from a book, right? There are 1.2 million Arab Israeli citizens who you won't know the difference, right? I mean, when you're walking around the mall in Netanya, they're in the shops with the same Jewish population. I mean, if that's apartheid, I'm not sure where that definition, like how that fit.
I've heard it more so from African immigrants. Like I've seen pictures. I can't really think of the name of the source, but the actual concentration camps. I wouldn't say concentration camps in the sense of how we would know it, like putting it with like the Holocaust, but separating them and just treating them like lower classes and almost equivalent to those who are imprisoned for just being Palestinian. It's like children held without trial as well. I mean, that's what
you know, I'd have to hear specifics. You know,
I don't have
as opposed, yeah. So this is for me. You know, what needs to happen in these conversations. There needs to be specifics, because I'll tell you what I see. I see Israel really laying themselves on the line economically and otherwise with the amount of Ethiopians, Sudanese who if they can make it through the real life and death obstacle course through Egypt, right, to get to the crossing where Israeli soldiers are basically feeding them and clothing them and water. I mean, it's like, you know, and you can read about these personal accounts online. Don't take my word for it. I mean, there's nothing in my experience of what I mean, I'm not saying that, I mean, if potentially there's a criminal element or what's happened, maybe there are specific cases where this has happened. The vast majority of stories that I'm hearing, not only from things like that I read about, but from people I know who are Israeli soldiers who are sitting right there watching these things, who literally put themselves on the line while the Egyptian army is shooting at these people trying to escape out of Egypt, trying to get to Israel, shooting them, trying to get across, while the Israeli soldiers are doing everything they can to get them into Israel. Right? I mean, tens of thousands of Africans flown to Israel. Right? Ethiopians that claim to be Jewish, right? Why should we have to take their word for it? I mean, huge strain on the economy of Israel. I mean, it just seems, it just doesn't, you know, again, there's a whole chapter in my book, Israel, humanitarian state or human rights abuser, right? And you got to read all the evidence and you decide for yourself, because it really is odd. You know, it doesn't fit like the story when you've got a state basically flying off halfway around the world to Haiti, right? To set up the most advanced hospital. America is right there, right? Like, it's nothing like. And even the American doctors are going, it's embarrassing. These guys flew halfway around the world, and look at what they've got set up. I mean, that's the same state that's killing, you know, African American. It's just not at, they fly all the way to Japan. Radioactive activity everywhere, right, for their emergency unit. They set up Hatzalah organizations. They have Save a Child's Heart, right? I mean, it primarily treats children, doesn't even treat, I don't even think they treat Israelis. It's a hospital set up for babies in the disputed territories who need transplants. They're not even Jewish. What, like, how does that add up with the type of state that's accused as like, the demonization? You understand? I'm not saying that bad things aren't happening. I'm just saying, you know, for me, you got to take a look at the holistic picture, apply your own critical thinking, and say, does this really add up? It doesn't seem to me. It doesn't add up. All these things. Are they perfect? No. All right. No. I mean, they moved their own population out of Gaza, and you should read the stories about what they did to Jews who are sitting living in tin cans for the last few years. I mean, why would they do something like that? So that they're not a perfect state. But I mean, they're also enormous examples of incredible humanitarianism that have nothing. Populations, thousands. Doesn't, you know, where's the... I just think that, you know, it all needs to be part of the conversation. It can't just be this part of the conversation. And state-sponsored racial segregation? No, that's what happened in South Africa. That has nothing to do with what happened in Israel. Why is there a barrier there? Okay? And there are Jews living on the other side of that barrier. Why is there a barrier there? That's a political situation. You've got two national entities trying to achieve their aspirations, and, you know, one is trying to protect their population while the other sorts itself out. That is not racial segregation. It's just a political wall. Just like the U.S. has a wall with Mexico, and the Arab world in Morocco they have a wall, and Saudi Arabia has a wall with you. I mean, there are things, you know, there are political situations that require some security measures, right? It's not racial segregation. I haven't seen that, and I'm not saying it's perfect for the Arab population in Israel. I'm not saying that, right? There is stuff. We haven't gotten there yet. It's a complicated problem, right? But I mean, apartheid? I don't know. I haven't seen it. I mean, not the kind of apartheid that definition is. I don't know where that comes from. I don't know. I'm just thinking it's got to be, you know, got to be a fair thing. And this with the second story, I'd have to know the specifics, because I see so much conflicting. You know, it doesn't add up.
Just also to add, coming from, I served in the military in Israel, and I have friends that are serving the border right now that are in the Syrian border. And the stuff that doesn't get shown also, that is not talked about, how much help is given to the Syrian citizens that are coming over the border and getting medical care, getting hospitality in Israel. Nobody talks about it. So just another more information, factual evidence about what actually goes behind the scenes that nobody really would like to talk about. And you know, I served with Ethiopian soldiers. I served with Sudanese, with Bedouin soldiers, with another in the north. They're Druze, with Druze soldiers that are not Arab and not Israeli. So it just shows just more of a factual evidence.
But I appreciate your asking these questions, and they're important questions to ask. And you know, it's always easier to have conversations about them when people are open to at least hearing, you know, all the information. Whatever they decide at the end, that's their choice. I mean, totally, I'm fine if people make informed decisions that are different than where I'm holding. I get it, okay? I mean, we don't have to see eye to eye, right? What I have a problem with is why we filter out any of the evidence that might refute, what we think. I think I have an enemy, let's say. That this person I know is my enemy. And yet, people are coming and telling me all these great things about the person. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. I only want to think about the person in the way that I've contextualized them. They're my enemy. That's not the truth. So.
Well, the second paragraph of the Hamas charter calls for the destruction of Israel. Perhaps that might be a good starting point for Hamas to take that out of their charter, and then that would be a good place for...
You mean with regard to the bombings?
With regards to everything.
Yeah.
Just a good starting point to begin a dialogue.
Yeah, it's, I hear. Again, it just really comes back to the person ultimately deciding what they think is justified in terms of what violent actions are justified. There are people who might say, I'm sorry, but I don't think any actions of violence are justified. I mean, there is no time when a war is just, right? I mean, I teach philosophy. This is one of the debates I have in my class, one of the topics I give. And there are numbers of students each year who say, I'm not going to ever, there's nothing you're ever going to tell me that's going to be, I'm going to think that war is justified. So I get it. People have different views. Well, I get that. Please.
I think it's important, it's not really a question, it's more of a comment. I think it's important to know a few things. Many Americans try to think of the decisions that have to be made in Israel from putting their mindset in the mindset of those people. Saying, oh, well, let's look at it with their mindset. Why don't we just put it in our mindset and say, how long would we deal with rockets landing here? It would take one. And it would be one the size of a bottle rocket. It wouldn't even be one.
It only took one.
That's it. It took
one attack, New York City, and look at what happened.
So
that's a daily occurrence.
It's important for us to just put it in terms of what we understand here to see how long we would deal with that. Second thing is two questions that I used to kind of refute the thing of, who's the bad guy or Israel's the bad guy. If Arabs would ask this question is, how many Arabs are on the Knesset? The Knesset has a very high percentage of Arabs. What country would allow people in their government that they would consider an enemy? There's no such thing, because the Arabs are not the enemy. They have them in their government because they say there's people here that are Arabs. We want them to be part of the decision-making process. And that's something that never becomes public. It almost seems like people say, well, this parliament is all made of a bunch of Jews who are just deciding the decisions for everybody, and that's not true. And
well, it's not totally untrue either, though. I mean, what do you think the chances are of an Arab becoming prime minister in Israel? Because I'm going to tell you, because like I said, I mean, in fairness, I don't know your name, but we have to do the whole truth, right? And I'm going to tell you, the chances of an Arab becoming prime minister in Israel, in my opinion, this, right? Maybe someday, or it would be a very pro-Israel Arab. I mean, I don't know how it would work, but I don't think the chances
are. It would just be this. In my opinion, hey, it would be fine as long as that person would say this: do you recognize Israel as a people? That you have the right to exist. That's why none of this negotiation happens, because you cannot negotiate with somebody that doesn't even recognize you exist as a person.
Well, that's true. But your premise with the government thing, again, not to take it to task, I appreciate your comments, by the way, thank you, is, I said that the things that aren't perfect in Israel, right? Israeli government, all governments, right? You guys just are you dealing with something? Is that still going on? Standoff.
It's still going on.
But the truth of the matter is Israel still has a ways to go in terms of its democratic process and its government. I mean, it is a democracy. There's no question about it in my mind in terms of the standard of human rights. Like freedom in the world rates nation states on certain characteristics. And there's no question. Really, to me, the essence of democracy is it's human rights. Minority people's rights. It's not just, how the voting structure works. But Israeli government has a ways to go. I mean, and if you read, if you want, I'm happy to send you some books on this subject. I mean, in terms of its democratic process and how it works when somebody gets voted into power, it's not America, right? So the Arabs may have representation there. It brings up another topic that I love to do that's really a great topic of debate. Can a Jewish state actually be a democracy? I mean, because you've got a significant Arab population, how much say do they really have? And then in reality, how much say could they really have within reason if the state's going to survive? I mean, the case of Israel is really sui generis, right? It's unique in many respects in history. You can't assign like the same types of democratic criteria or other criteria to its history and to other things as we do for other states. It's just the way it is. I mean, there is no territory on earth, no piece of real estate that has been fought over more than Jerusalem. I mean, it's a unique place in history, so it has many unique characteristics. It's the birthplace, or the home, maybe not the birthplace, it's the home, the very important home to three of the monotheistic traditions of the world. I mean, that's gonna create some complications. Right? Please, sorry. Yeah, you've been patient, so hang on one second. I'll get him in then. Sorry.
Are there any talks right now about logistics for a two-state, for a Palestinian state, specifically with a fully functioning government, or have a fully functioning military? How, logistically, what's going on with that? Are there any talks about that?
Yeah, and honestly, I think I would, like you, love to be a fly on the wall with the Palestinian Authority, because really the question sits as much with them as it does with anybody outside of them. I mean, I don't understand, how they haven't progressed, right? But I do understand, if you're dealing with human beings, and it's a lot of money, right? And if you read the statistics on Yasser Arafat's net worth at the time of his death, I mean, some people have gotten very rich as a result of this conflict. I mean, war is very good business, right? Not for the everyday person, right? And so, this is the problem that you're dealing with. You're dealing with like an oligarchy, power of very few who control a whole lot of money. It's a lot of money. And, how many of us could really rise above that and not fall into the, I don't know. I'd like to think I could, but I'm not sure.
It seems like, I just don't see how when you set up setting up elections and just become corrupt, and then you have a full functioning military. It just seems like free range.
Thank you guys for coming.
Free range on just terrorists and free function. No control over anything.
It's difficult.
You can't really demilitarize, have like a demilitarized.
That's a real pie in the sky idea in that region. Yeah. I mean, demilitarized means you've got to keep that white area that I showed you. It's the only chance you have of having demilitarized areas. Yeah. Let me get him and then I'll get you. I'm sorry, I've been holding him off for like so long. I'm sorry to feeling Jewish guilt.
I was going to say, this might seem a little out of my field thing I'm about to ask, but everyone focuses on Israeli Palestinian fighting, but when you look at the greater Middle East, and it goes back to the money thing you're talking about, war being profitable. The real enemy in this conflict is Iran or Saudi Arabia, and everyone else is just a chess piece on this board. And
okay, so I believe you. It's a dimension of the conflict between both Sunni and Shia.
So as you said, the war is profitable. It's the war of oil. It is what the profit is.
It's one of the dimensions, yeah. And so there's a lot of dimensions in the whole. There's a lot of dimensions to the whole conflict. I mean, it's really. I find it fascinating. It's just there's so much in it. You can't boil it down to one particular.
The thing that just bothers me when you look at the Middle East conflict is, even outside of the Israeli area, you got Sunnis and Shiites trying to kill each other. Then they'll ally together to wipe out everyone else. But then as soon as they were hypothetically to wipe everyone else, they'll just go keep killing each other too. So until there's only one of those two Muslims left. So it makes you wonder when you have an environment like that, is peace possible? When you've got these two groups that want to do everything except have peace.
Yeah, it's a complicated region. People are passionate. It goes to the core of their identities and their beliefs and their value systems. You know, just like America is very passionate about its values. People are passionate, you know. Please.
Thank you. My question, I guess, is you kind of touched on it a little bit, like the forgotten refugees from Arab countries, the Jews. My background, I'm Turkish, so they fled, and my friends from Libya, Iraq, Morocco, same story, had to flee. Why do you think it is that the international community doesn't really consider them to be refugees in the same sense that they do as Palestinians?
If you're asking me my opinion, Israel absorbed them, and so did the rest of the world. I mean, they have just integrated into the societies that they found themselves in, and they moved on. And for whatever reasons, the Arab world has chosen to not let many of these people who have been put in difficult circumstances move on. I mean, you know, if you're from Lebanon. I mean, I don't know what it would be like to be a Palestinian Arab living in Lebanon, but I would not want it. I mean, you know, if you, like, you know, you talk about apartheid and places where the laws of the state, you know, and the whole culture prevents advancement. I mean, you know, Jews and anti-German, like even in Toronto, the city where I'm from, in the early part of the 20th century, Jews, doctors, you can't go to medical school, we're not letting you in. Maybe we'll let a token Jew in, but Jews can't. Good luck trying to be a doctor if you're a Palestinian Arab living in Lebanon. I mean, it's just really unfortunate, you know, the way that it's a really difficult history that many of these people have had, and it's a long history of not being on the best side of, you know, these numerous powers that have been struggling back and forth, and we can go back centuries, right? Ottomans, and you know, and then colonial powers, and you know, it's hard. I mean, you know, so I think the reason is because one group basically, Israel's, let's go, get in here and let's just get on with it. And that hasn't been the psychology on the other side. It almost happened, right? You know, a story that doesn't get told very much is the West Bank from 1967 until Yasser Arafat takes over in basically the 80s. You know that it was one of the fastest growing economies in the world. I mean, you know, it's not like the people there can't do it or want to do it. I mean, but you know, like I said, being a welfare state was good business for Arafat, in my opinion. You know, I don't have a high opinion of him or the leadership, because when Israel had control of that region, the infrastructure, the universities, the education, you look at the growth there, and you can read about these statistics. Was it perfect? Did they want to be under Israeli administration? Were they thankful for all these opportunities? No, I don't think they necessarily. Look, we were under the Ottomans, right? We don't need to be under the Jewish state now. But the fact of the matter is, there were a lot of people were like, yeah, it's not ideal. Just like Palestinians nowadays, I'll show you stuff on my computers. Like I don't know why this clip went on Al Jazeera. It was so bizarre to me that they played it. But I have it on my computer. I can show you Al Jazeera news reporter interviewing a Palestinian worker, right, in the settlement building south of Jerusalem. Aren't you upset that you're building homes for Jewish people? You know what his answer was? Upset. You know, what are the Arabs doing? Right? I have a job. I feed my family. I mean, you know, what are you talking about? I mean, you know, it's not an issue for me. I'm great. Okay, you know, is that everybody? Absolutely not. Is that the majority? Maybe not. I mean, but you know, I don't know. I just don't, like, all that I understand from the refugee situations, you don't hear about it. The international community doesn't say anything about it because it's gone. It's not an issue anymore. And it was gone just a few years after it appeared. I mean, you know, it's this one that won't go, doesn't have an end. And it doesn't have an end because I believe there is an intention on one side to keep it going. And I believe the international community, even though they print out all these reports about how great a job they're doing, also has set up a whole, you know, the UNRWA, like, Why does one particular refugee population in the entire world have an entire governing body that's massive versus all the other communities in the world, just one body focused on one people, right? Because there's so many versus other? No, I don't, it's just, it's the whole thing's crazy. I mean, the world has made a great job of keeping this population in the situation that they're in.
Last thing for me is what makes the people in the territory like Gaza embrace, or do they embrace Hamas and Hezbollah? Because my dad, I sent him to Israel, fulfilled his lifelong dream of going there, and he said the same thing as you. He said, "Oh, it's so beautiful. The Arab people, the Israelis, so beautiful. They're all so nice, living peacefully amongst each other." And yet,
I don't think I said that.
No, I'm telling you.
But I want to hear the rest of what you're saying. But just to clarify, in case I did give the wrong impression, there are places in Israel where you can go to where the populations mingle. It's not, they're not separate.
That's what I'm talking about.
That they love each other so much. That's a whole different story.
Right. Well, I'm just saying that areas obviously where people live in tourist areas and people are living in peace. Okay, maybe they don't feel that they love each other, but they can't live in peace.
Right.
So, but what makes people in these territories embrace, or do they embrace, groups like Hamas and Hezbollah that are just holding them down and putting rockets on top of their own apartment buildings and stuff like that?
So let me ask you, okay? I don't know. You have, I don't know. You look young enough not to have a family, so I don't know whether you do it.
41 with 2 kids.
You know what? I wish I looked like I wish I looked like you. So let me ask you a question. All right? You're a dad. You go to work, right? And Joe Schmendrick shows up, right? With 6 Uzis around his thing and basically says, "I'm putting rockets on your roof." You got a problem with that? You know? Your answer is yes. Your kids can be orphans. You make a decision. Or we can put the rock, like literally, what is the population supposed to do? I mean, you know, I used to think about this too. You know what? They're accountable for their leadership, right? Do something. And then right before it was out of my mouth, I was like, yeah, big talker, right? Somebody comes to my home, I have 2 kids also, and basically says, "No, this is what's going to happen." They might sweet talk me, you know? Yeah, you know what? Do something for the cause. I know what the mess. These are people that are going to use my kid, right, as a human shield. I'm going to argue with them. It doesn't matter if there's 100,000 of them and 50 of the guys with the guns. The guns speak aloud. They talk, right? What are those people supposed to do? I mean, you know, I don't know that they have an easy time organizing, and maybe God willing, you know, they will have an opportunity to change. It's hard. I mean, I don't know what some of them can do. So many of them are kept very poor. I don't know. It seems like a much more a tough situation, because I used to say the same thing, but I don't know what I would do. I mean, it's hard. I don't know. All right. Oh, yeah. You can, if you want. If people can stay if you want. I mean, I stay as long as you want. You're welcome to ask.
I don't know too much
Thank you.
besides what I've heard today. It all seems like it comes down to like religion really being the issue to me. As I don't know where I'm going with this.
So can I just address, it does seem like that, but I want to tell you, in my opinion, having studied this now in depth for quite a long time, it's not just religion, okay? And first of all, the bottom line is it's people, okay? So it's, you know, religion is not bad, right? You can watch Christopher Hitchens, actually, if you want to get those supporting arguments, but brilliant guy, by the way. But you're dealing with human beings. You're always dealing with human beings. And this conflict, why it's fascinating to me and also tragic to look at, it's not just, it's so, we were talking, it's not, it's multidimensional. It's economics. It's religion. It's territory. Just had a brain cramp. It's political. So, and there's one other one that and it's religion, right? I mean, there's like, it's culture also. I mean, you can't separate that. I mean, the Arab people, they're a culture also. And, you know, you've got, in 1940, well, earlier than that, from the late 19th century on, you've got the influx of another huge culture coming into your culture who maybe you don't agree with, right? We don't want women working in the field. You know, none of these are necessarily bad or prehistoric. It's just the way it's a lot. You've got history, you've got religion, you've got economics, you've got culture, you've got globalization, you've got, like, it's such a soup,
What if
right?
there is a major value change, though?
In what way? Well, that in some way, you know, somebody made a comment just a little while ago. It was very interesting when they said, you know, what if we could put yourself, use our thinking in their position? You know, that's the problem in many cases with the West. You know, we don't understand that we see the world only through the lens of a Western mentality. What you started saying just now, even though you know, I'm a Westerner, and I may be totally on your side, but what we need to understand is, why should our values, who says that those values are wrong, right? They're wrong in our contextualization of the world. We have a value system, right? And we go ahead and try and think of, wow, look at these people all the way over there. I mean, how can they not clearly see what I know is right? I mean, you know, so value change means that you have an assumption, number one, that your values, well, maybe it should be the other way around. Maybe they're saying, you know, when is that other side going to see what we see, and the value, maybe it's the, you understand the problem?
Yeah.
Right? Now, you know, for me, I'd like to think that all people have the same, you know, at their core, they have, it may be true, maybe it isn't, but I mean, you can't, like, we're approaching it from a lens that, I mean, the West is right, you know? Our values are right, you know? It's them that's wrong. And we do it personally too, right? I mean, and maybe that's true and maybe it isn't, but that's for people to decide, right? Yes, there are things I disagree with because I'm from the West. You know, I'm not going to be okay with somebody sticking a child in front of them in the middle of a war, right? And I'm not saying that that's the values that that whole culture holds either. That's not what I'm trying to say. But we need to appreciate that they see the world a lot differently, and they see some of our ways as being quite an obstacle to having a working society. I'll give you one example, right? I mean, television and shows like Baywatch. I mean, why should a culture have to think that that's necessarily a positive thing, and that, you know, America shows up with their movie industry and their food and all their stuff, and that's going to be, it's democracy, it's capitalism. The history has shown that these are the greatest systems. You understand the problem? I mean, maybe
not everyone thinks that's necessarily.
I agree. I'm just no. It was just one example that, you know, to start the sentence with a change in values. Okay, so Hamas maybe that's like, because that's extreme, but the rest of the culture, I don't know. There are some things I see in those cultures that I think, you know, we could take some lessons from some of the things, right? I mean, leave the fanaticism out of it, because, you know, look, fanatical democracy can be a problem also, right? Take a look at some of the things that North America, I don't want to just box America into things, but here's some of the stories of things that we've done in terms of the, but thank you for the question. I do see what you're saying. And yes, we probably do have the same lens that we're, thank you guys. I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming.
Oh, here's something. Most people